My name's Marie Brett. I'm a visual artist. I make filmic works and also sculptural installations that very much now involve performance. I suppose in terms of my drive or my kind of conceptual interests are very much around people's lived life experiences of trauma. And I suppose with that comes a kind of sense of social injustice in some cases, and often kind of experiences that would have some kind of cultural stigma. So I'd have made works in the past about, I suppose, illness, death, dying, kind of different aspects of loss. And I'd involve a lot of different people in the making of works as well. So social practice for me is very much working with other people they may inform or they may inspire or they may critically challenge me. And I think people may not identify in the main as being artists themselves. And they may be individuals that I'd work with, or they may be part of a group. It might be a formal group, kind of aligned to an institution or an organisation, or it might be a looser collective of people that have some kind of, community of interest. Or it might be just one person. And I suppose it's thinking, well, why do I seek out working with people, or why might they want to work with me? And for me, there's a reciprocity in terms of we're both after something, but they might be different things. And a lot of the people that I would work with, they'd have very particular lived life experience, or they might have beliefs and opinions that again would be different to mine, or they might have like an embedded knowledge or skill set. So it's a kind of real cross-section of people that I'd work with that for me forms my social practice, or I suppose the sphere of social practice. And my starting point is very often a question and a curiosity. And it might lie low for a long time, so it might be on the back boil. It might have evolved from an earlier piece of work, so it's something that's left unanswering or kind of what I'd call unfinished business, or it might be something that's just come from somewhere else, that's the question that lurks. And I wait and see, does it have, legs? Will it stay with me? And what meanings does it have for me? If it almost haunts me, this question. I'd often do fairly long periods of research to investigate and to think in an open-ended way about this one question and invite people in, and it might be through the form of a residency. So if you take, for example, one of the case study projects that I've done, which is one of the Yes But Do You Care pieces, I was doing a residency at IMA, at the Irish Museum of Modern Art, and I had a series of questions that I was thinking about that could be different pieces of work. And while I was in Dublin, resident in their studio, there was a Law Society event where people were beginning to talk about capacity legislation, new legislation that was coming into Ireland. And something that was lurking in the back of my mind from an earlier project that I'd made about capacity and about the role and rights of carers in terms of caring for people who had a dwindling capacity. And I thought, this is actually really interesting that the capacity legislation in Ireland is changing, which I didn't know. And there's an event here where there's an opportunity to hear from, I suppose there were solicitors, advocates, carers, human rights activists, so a whole cross-section. So I went along to this event and listened and absorbed and thought, okay, I really want to make a work about this. And who do I need to work with to find out more? So I approached some of the people that were presenting. I approached the Alzheimer's Society of Ireland, who linked me with the Dementia Carers Campaign Network, because I felt a campaign network that work as advocates might be interested in exploring this topic of this new legislation called the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act. And I really wanted to know, what's this mean for carers? Because everyone's priority is thinking about the human rights of a person living with a dementia or a dwindling capacity or an affected capacity. But what about the carer was what I was interested in. So Yes But Do You Care is a work of 3 parts, 3 distinct separate works. So there's a filmic art piece, there is a performative event that's like a performative installation in a huge warehouse, and then there's a documentary film about that live event. And all the 3 pieces explore the idea conceptually of how a person has the right to make a bad decision. And it explores if the person's being looked after by someone else, so if they have a diminished capacity and they're being cared for by a family member, what's the implication for the family member then when they have the right to make a bad decision?
Everything gets lost and I get blamed. He forgets. Then he remembers he forgot. He's cold, but opens all the windows. Sometimes he's so far in the dream that I just can't reach him. He says the room's filling with thousands of snakes. He jumped out of the window and was 3 miles down the road. I sit in the kitchen, cry, hidden behind closed doors. That's the part of caring that's forgotten about. Where are we? Israel. Where are we? Syria. Where are we? London. You learn how to cope. Trying to find the dog that's already died. Trying to go home. Where did you go? 10 times a day. I'm told I'm lucky because he's obsessed with the housework. White lies and guilt. Accusation, justification. His right to make a bad decision. I looked after him for 3 years, a week, and 3 days. Whether it's your mother, your sister, your uncle, your aunt, you live with the disease as well. I'm not allowed to get old.
So I suppose whoever I might end up working with, who might choose to be interested in pursuing something, critically or conceptually with me, I think it's really important for any practitioner, but I'm always keep it in the forefront of my mind that my priorities and needs and my intentions are going to be different from theirs. And I think also, especially when you don't know what the outcome will be. So if you're going into creating a work together and you know there'll be a public outcome, and I'm very, very honest about that, but you don't know what form it might take, it's to own that and to, I suppose, build from the contributors having a sense of other work that you've done before, or getting to know you as a person and seeing that, hopefully they'll see you have kind of, honesty and integrity, and you'll hold firm to what you believe is true, but you will negotiate and shift and move, and you're looking to negotiate and shift and move conceptually your thinking. But you're always going to be an artist, and the art making process is always going to be really important. So you're not going to become an advocate, you're not going to become an activist, you're not going to represent their health needs. The work might, if they or their supporters or their activists and networks find means and ways to talk through the art piece at a later date. But that's not my job and role, if that makes sense. I never use the term memorandum of understanding. I always use the term, but I do use them. But I use the term a kind of an agreement because I think it sounds a little less scary. And yeah, for many, many years I've always written up an agreement. And I remember years back when I was working overseas and just starting out, I felt it was a way for me to anchor my memory of what my understanding was to myself, and then to openly and honestly represent that to, in this case it was an institution, so that if I was doing 3 or 4 different projects, I had a very firm place to go back to for myself, and also it nailed what my expectations were in a kind of matter-of-fact way that isn't always easy to do in conversation, I find, for the people that I was inviting to work with, or that they were inviting to work with me. And I was a bit nervous, but I thought I'm just going to do this because I think this is really important. And then the reaction was really, really positive when I kind of first started out. And it meant the work could go further, faster, deeper, because we weren't then in the middle of the work trying to negotiate some of the practicalities that can be kind of ironed out at the early stages. Now I find that I'm doing projects that might be 2 years in distance and time, and then might output a year later. It's quite important to then have a touchstone as to what are the kind of core values in terms of the philosophy and thinking, as well as the roles and responsibilities. What can I actually ask of my host organisations? Or, you can cut your cloth to suit your suit, really. But yeah, I think they're really important. But everyone can find their own language as to what to call them, or how to create them. you know. I suppose for each project it would be different. So if it's a small scale project, I try and keep something to a page personally, and I try and bullet point things so they're really easily accessible. And I'd always suggest that this is a moving document, so it's not a fixed thing until we agree that it's a fixed thing. So there's a reciprocal kind of in and out. And I suppose there's all the kind of classic things like contact details, and it can be really important for me to know how people prefer to be contacted. Do they actually like using the telephone, or would they prefer to be Skyping, or and I think also because I'm working with people very often who've had a very challenging kind of live life experience, they've been through different traumas. I have to be really sensitive to how do I communicate with people and at what times of the day, and all this kind of very factual information. And then as well as basic things like budget, breakdown of who's responsible for what in terms of administration, all the kind of production side of things in terms of materials. I think something that's really important is, I suppose, who's going to manage all the kind of administration, and is it going to be divided between an artist and another individual, or a chairperson of a group, or if it might be some organisational member of staff. Who's doing what and why, and also a schedule. So, are there milestones along the way? What's expected by when? Is there a get-out clause at each stage? How are we evaluating? What supports are there for me and the contributors? Are there advisors? Are there mentors? Who's documenting? Why and how? Who's handling consent forms? So it kind of can go on and on and on. But I suppose, it's, I think the accessibility of it's the important thing. Torpedo was a project that I did with another artist called John McCarg, and also a big team of a community called Rescue Camden, who were volunteers that were really interested in rescuing an ex-military fort in Crosshaven in County Cork. So it's a coastal artillery fort. We made a site-responsive sculptural installation with several live performative elements, and it spans the fort site predominantly underground. So we made works and pieces that were located in places like the ammunitions room and an out-of-bounds engine room. John and myself just really loved these rooms that were deep underground, like 100 steps down at sea level, under phenomenal kind of hills, with these huge big diesel tanks in them, very rough underfoot, pitch dark, big gapes in the sea defence walls. So really exciting, visceral spaces that were totally out of bounds, except to the volunteers who would, over time be thinking that they might be able to get them open to the public with, lots of works done. And I said to John, God, what would it take to make an art piece in here? This would be phenomenal. So cutting a long story short, through negotiating and through really rigorous risk assessments, we managed to get part of the work located in those spaces. And obviously, it took the will and the drive of the people that were collaborating with us, and that intimate knowledge of the fort, and a team that kind of, I suppose, valued and were driven on ambitiously being brave within a space and within a concept. So we were all on the same page, but it was actually, the rigour of having our documentation very tightly aligned, that then when multiple people came in to check, we could find routes through that the boxes could be ticked. And it was really liberating to think it didn't prohibit and it didn't stem. It actually enabled us to go the extra mile and get into these amazing space. And then, interestingly, we felt we'd love to make the work in pitch darkness and not have light, use torchlight, very kind of radically pushing it out in terms of bats were flying around and stuff. And again, we were able to do that. So I think it was, an exciting time of seeing, don't see this as just trudge paperwork you have to do. It actually can be a real asset and a real ally to pushing your practice out if you work with it. It's easy to get frightened by something like a risk assessment and think it's this abstract thing that's going to trip you up. Whereas actually I feel it's a really powerful tool to be able to push out and keep control of your ambition for your work. I think the biggest advice I have on risk assessment is what can go wrong and what can you do to help prevent it. So to think of it as simply as that. Like, you know, if you're in a field and it's raining and you're on grass, what can happen? It can become a muddy slush pit. You can slip and fall over. What could you do? Could you make several routes instead of having one trackway that just becomes a muddy, sloppy kind of mess? In terms of, like, you know, working in the darkness in a kind of, you know, a space that only has one way in and out and has an unnerving floor. You know, what can you do if someone, you know, has a panic attack and needs to get out or trips up and falls? You know, so you have someone out of sight with a big floodlight that at any time can kind of put a light on the whole space. You know, you have stewards out of sight that can instantly come to the rescue of somebody and help them. You limit your numbers so there is no overcrowding issue. So it's all about that very simplistic thinking, well, not simplistic, that very simplified way of thinking. What can go wrong and what can you do to prevent it? You're also then trying to think, how extreme can the consequences be? So I'd work with risk assessments where, is there going to be a fatality? So if I'm working with someone, you know, performatively with a chainsaw, an artery could be cut, there could be a fatality. So, you know, if that gets ticked on your box, you're really, really going to have to pay attention to that then. Whereas if I'm working with someone with needles and scissors, they're going to have a little cut. It's not going to be fatal, it's going to be very minor. So in terms of, you know, staging your risk assessment, in terms of the potential for damage, whether it's to the body or facilities or equipment, that's the next layer then. I think it's worth people thinking about. I often use the term that, you know, we're working on a pivot of risk and trust, because for me, the two go hand in hand. You do need to risk, or else you're not pushing your practice out, you know, you're standing still. And similarly, you need to trust both the give and take of that. So I think if you were looking to get into a social arts practice, something that might be worth doing would be to ask, could you spend a tiny bit of time with different practitioners? So I know different artists have very different kind of models of ways of working and approaches and philosophy, and even if you could just spend a tiny bit of time, I think I found that really helpful in terms of, you know, honing my practice and my thinking. Just to, I suppose, be exposed, and then you can either be thinking, I fully agree with that way of working, or that doesn't quite line up and fit for me. So you get it out of your head and you get it into the kind of, you know, the physical reality of the space of the world. But you're not having to lead and take all the steps yourself. So, you know, whether you call it shadowing, whether you're asking for mentoring, you know, I'd kind of really encourage people to go to whatever kind of, you know, opportunities that there are to hand for them, whether it's their local authority, whether it's the Arts Council, whether it's Create, you know, whether it's other forms of funding, and just ask for a tiny little bit of seed funding or support to see, can they approach someone and say, could I spend a tiny bit of time with you? And not be frightened to ask for a little bit of help in saying, I don't quite know all the answers here, but I'm keen to learn, as opposed to feeling you have to start, you know, 100% fully there and formed, you know. And then I think the other thing that I'd really recommend is make a small ask. Make it manageable. Don't make it kind of terrifying. Like if someone approached me and wanted to work with me for a year, I'd be kind of quietly terrified. Whereas if they, you know, wanted to meet me, you know, for an afternoon, I think, okay, that's manageable. I've got a good back door, you know. And it's like connecting with a person. It's all about people, and it's about, you know, dealing with humanity. So it's to get it off the page and into the room and space and time with a person or with people. You know, I think that's so important. But I've spoken a lot with individuals and groups about this sense of the ask or the invitation and what helps that. And I think, you know, honesty and clarity, passion and enthusiasm, and it being manageable, a small ask, and talking about the straightforward things like money, time, expenses, who pays for the coffee, space, in COVID time, safety. Have all that in the mix, you know, and hold it lightly.